Spell for January 3rd, 2023. For all of you who are looking at this chronologically, or who knows how you're going to be watching this, I'm a pagan out of the multiverse, and today I have a little bit of solar flare problem again, but we are not going to worry about that. And we're with the Rev Don Lewis,
Hello.
internationally and famously known for all sorts of things, including being a psychic and order of religious order, and most importantly, as an instigator of shenanigans. But we will talk about that another time.
Yes.
Well, maybe not. Do you consider you a person that likes shenanigans?
It depends on your definition of the term.
Okay, so that.
But if we mean enjoyable adventures, yes.
Oh, okay. Well, shenanigans have many, many ideas.
That's why I say.
Right. And so we're out into the world today. We'll continue to expand in our voice and conversation. And I think we're going to start right away with the idea of volunteerism. As people know, I've been putting out a cry for volunteers. I said I need to organize volunteers on a large level. I've got many people who are involved in many projects, and oh my God, the number of parallel projects out there that lack both the capital and the volunteer base, but have the great passion are filling my DMs and my emails. And it really bothers me to a certain degree because I haven't really formulated a good letter. I would tell people, like, I love the idea of what you're doing. And yeah, you need more volunteers. We all do out there. But let me start with, why are volunteers important to you? Do you use a lot of volunteers?
Our tradition staff is pretty much entirely volunteer,
Mm-hmm.
to hundreds of people,
Right.
serving thousands of people. Um, with the kind of organizations we commonly have in the pagan world, volunteer staff is what you're going to have, because usually there's not enough money to do otherwise. There are
Mhm.
exceptions, and there can be exceptions, and the two things can coexist together. But very often you must have volunteers to help get things done because there's simply not the capitalization to do it other ways. Even when there is, if you have volunteer help, it will go much farther. Um, and if you look at the pagan community, the vast majority of everything is run by volunteers.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that gets into the first thing is that if I can't find volunteers or I don't know who's doing it, I'm going to do this my project myself.
Hmm.
I know I'm one of those people who have that energy.
Yeah, yes.
Uh, and the Daily Spell here is an example of it. Again, just guiding and finding not the right volunteers or enough volunteers to actually help me have a staff of progressives. So Don and I are going to do it for ourselves, and we are looking for your help. If you want to join us for one of these evenings and be either a guest, especially about movies, we're going to talk about public domain next,
Yeah.
and or about spells or anything else you want to add to this mix. This is our experimental look at the life of us as witches on a daily basis. I
Yes.
will mention today, if you have not seen the HBO Max, or is it AMC special, We're All Witches, with Lilith Dorsey got her own little trailer today for it. It's out there. They're talking about witches. It's really good. It's really interesting. It's mostly on focus and I think a lot on the feminist witch, but oh my gosh, it's really good. And it's a mainstream company doing it for the Mayfair witches. So we're talking about witchcraft. And I've been talking about how we've reached so much more mainstream. In order to have bigger organizations, we do have to have volunteers.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. And we want to say hello to Nicole in the chat room.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading an article today about the celebrations of people for whom Christmas is not the holiday. And this was a perfectly mainstream article on Yahoo, I think, or somewhere they connected to. And they talked about Hanukkah, of course. They talked about Kwanzaa, of course. But they had numerous entries for Yule from pagan people.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very, very impressed to see that. And I think we need to be very mindful of that mainstream community and the fact that we are there, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. We are
Mm-hmm.
there now, And hello to Margarita. And I think this is a very important thing to be aware of. But going back to volunteerism, we've done a lot of things over the course of many years, but almost all of them um, relied heavily on volunteers. I often talk about the old pagan press. It was entirely volunteer, or almost entirely anyway.
Well, it wasn't even worse. It was mostly passion plays. I mean, not only was it volunteers writing and drawing, but it was also people paying to get those magazines produced. I mean,
Yes, that's
I mean,
true.
it was people paying out of their own pockets even on top of that.
Sometimes, although I will say a number of the old pagan zines from the 80s did have subscribers who
Mhm.
actually did sometimes offset the cost of printing. Not
Okay.
always, by any means. Often it was paid for by the publisher, the editor, who was the same
Mhm.
person usually. Um, but if they could get enough people to buy them, they were certainly happy. But
Mhm.
many of them never printed more than 20 to 100 copies. Some of them did more. I know that the Unicorn had once had a subscribership of 300, and then the editor decided to charge for the magazine, although it was a very small price, and the readership dropped to 30
Mhm.
overnight. Although I'm sure it built back up over time. And that was 1985 or something like that. Um, so yes, often they were not only volunteering their time, they were paying for the things to happen, and that's still the case in much of the pagan community today.
And I'm seeing it with everybody talking about trying to create the next witch fox thing and everything else. So people have asked me, why did I say that I need a large amount of volunteering? Because I think I'm going to start. What we're going to start doing is the next step we have to do is map the community. What I've come to more than anything else, we have to map the community. Where is it today? I mean, everyone talks about Witch Fox, which did a great job of mapping the community right at the turn of the century.
Hmm.
That's its main claim to fame is it really did map our community in a way we hadn't seen it and gave us really good connections.
Yes.
As seeing how the community was. And I also feel like that, we grew completely out of the Guru Plus system. And if people ever don't know what the Guru Plus system is, it's an idea about an early computer that we are actually all still amateur computer users. There's very few. We may pretend we're professionals, but very few of us are actually professional computer users. What we are is we learn from the person next to us, or the associate or the friend. In the early days,
Hmm.
the guru was the person who basically who learned it 2 weeks ago, mastered it last week, and now is teaching you. Because things
Yes.
move that fast. And I think it'll continue to move that fast. People don't it, but the vast majority of computer users are not by any means professional. We're all kind of amateurish in our own way.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I have to agree with that, and I think there's a lot of good in that because it keeps things flexible and moving. Um,
Hmm.
and of course, there are professionals, but they don't tend to be the ones who are doing the everyday things. They're the ones who are creating the actual infrastructure, the programming, etc. But even then, often, I mean, I think it's often still very much seat of pants because things develop so quickly, and the people have to stay on top of it.
And I think that's another thing that's added to both the good of volunteerism and the difficulty. It takes a lot to keep people attention, and I
Hmm.
think volunteerism depends on keeping people's attention.
Yes, it
I think
does.
I think the thing that makes that for a good volunteer is somebody who can spend a certain amount of time, not a
Hmm.
lot, but a certain amount of time consistently on a project.
Hmm.
Um, and then, of course, that becomes a danger of feeling like a part-time job, right? I get that,
Well,
but being
it often does, I think.
and you work on it consistently, and that there is a goal. But I think for volunteers, the thing that they need is positions that actually move the community forward. All too often, people volunteer around projects that don't have a completion, or they never end, or you can't beat them, or there's never a structure change
Hmm.
um, because they are always continuous,
Yeah.
and they burn out and they don't ever see a real win. And I think as a volunteer, you need to see that your time, which is your investment, your
Hmm.
chrono investment into something. I said we're chrono investors.
Yes.
We've donated not so much money, though we've donated a lot of that, and taken back a certain amount of money to live, but we've invested time. Our entire community is based on invested time into long-term structures.
Hmm.
When you volunteer, you want to know that you're making a difference, period.
I think that's very important. I think that much of what keeps volunteers going is feeling that what they're doing is important, feeling that they're appreciated, and feeling that they see results.
Hmm.
Um, and it depends on the organizations that we're talking about, on the regions we're talking about, how much that actually follows through. I think very often when you see volunteers burn out, it's because those elements are missing. Or the other thing that sometimes happens that is that they don't know how to delegate themselves, and so they can't bring on help and eventually burn out.
So,
Oh, and hello to Byron.
hello. So yeah, so that's
Byron
uh,
makes a very good point that a weakness of many organizations is calling for volunteers before knowing what they need volunteers for, before having their tasks clearly delineated.
okay, and I'm guilty of that. I'm definitely guilty of that. My latest call was I want to. Sometimes I just want to see what the skill set of what I'm trying to do. But then I'm a broad thinker, and I do have some accomplished projects. But yeah, I think that's true.
I think it can sometimes be very true. I think there are other times when you don't know what you need until you see what you've got.
Hmm.
Um, Byron admits that she too is guilty of this. I think we're all guilty of that. But you can't always tell exactly what you're going to need, because you'll find that person who can do something that you did not know they could do, and then you need support for them. Um, I think a lot of times, I have a reputation that if someone makes a suggestion in the Corellian tradition, it becomes their job, which is a little exaggerated, but not entirely,
Hmm.
because until you know you have someone who can do it, you don't necessarily want to start it.
Hmm.
When you find you have someone who has the skill and the interest, if they're willing to do it, by all means, tell them to do it if they're
Yeah, but
willing to be
that's
voluntold.
right. But that's right. There we go. I'm trying to figure out some. Never mind. Okay. There we
I
go.
use the phrase voluntold, but no one can actually be voluntold anything.
That's true.
They either choose to do it or they don't.
So my next step is in the volunteering base that we're creating is I'm looking for local. I wanted to use organizers, but people use that term to they feel like it's too big. What I'm looking for is organized information. We're going to map the pagan community. I think that's finally the next step.
Hmm.
Pagan World's all about it. We're reaching to all sorts of places. Thank you everybody for making this such a successful project so far. But I think we need to map the community next,
Hmm.
and so that's where we're at.
The community, like so many things in life, it's constantly the same and constantly evolving at the same time.
Hmm.
And where we are today is not where we were 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Hmm.
Um, there have been vast changes that we should be trying to keep up with. We should be conscious of. One of the things we were talking about earlier today is that back in the day when we were working in a particular community, one of the things we learned is that many of the people there were not part of the community at all, but they were right there.
Hmm.
Um, I think sometimes we have blinders on as to what is actually present and available, and mapping the community will help with that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things I think we have is definitely a mismatch. I've had people now since the Oberon incident, and it's
Hmm.
it's going to become. I think this was a shedding moment in our community,
Hmm.
um, because it was a moment where the community was really ready to help, put a more positive long-term solution into place, and
Hmm.
the very people who wanted to claim they wanted that help did not want that long-term solution.
Yes.
And because what it was would leave some of the control in other people's hands. It's not. It was they wanted a transference of money and resources so that they can make the decisions, and they didn't want to make the social contract with the people they were agreeing with, who were willing to volunteer time, money, and energy towards them, but they wanted a social contract. What is that social contract in volunteering? Is that you are going to lead them into successful accomplishment of an act.
Yeah,
And
that
I
they're
think,
doing more than pouring their time down the toilet.
and that's why some people love to clean up certain areas. Now, some people say that would be, like Nephelplic, Northeastern
Hmm.
Florida Political Action
Pagan Leadership Coalition.
Coalition. Wow, that's a tongue twister too.
It is, yes. That's why we call it Nephelplic.
And let us go ahead before we get into Nephelblick. Let's talk about another tongue twister. We're at 1415 for our crowdfunding campaign for our
Reverend
field.
Don Super Omnibus of Magical Incantations and Invocations for All Occasions by Reverend Don Lewis and Sir Marianne Kay.
Right. And it's a great little book and everything else. And so, but let's talk about Nephelplick. They have a good example of a good volunteer project. They call everybody in. The leadership is ready. They have it, and that is their cleanup. So once a month, they take an area and clean it up. And they have tools ready. They have bags ready. They've got extra gloves ready, and they actually know what they're doing. Their leadership is ready to set up. We're going to clean this, and it isn't just some random thing. They start assigning people duties, and they carry it out.
Yes.
And they have a good time in talking about that. And volunteers walk away from that. Then they go have coffee with everybody afterward, or drink, or lunch, all the above, and then they go on with their lives. They've taken 5, 6, 7 hours out of the month, and they've cleaned something that may or may not say clean, but obviously I've been a part of these projects, they clean it. It's cleaned. They haven't been cleaned in years.
Yes.
And so makes people feel better, makes people feel stronger.
Mm-hmm.
We have lots of projects like that, but people don't talk about them. We have then the second tier of volunteerism, and I think it's important. And I think a lot of we're caught up in this is it's really volunteerism, even if you're the leader, is to teach the community. I think the number one place I think people feel like, and this is where it is, and it's one of the biggest conflicts in our community is about teaching. So many people see teaching as a volunteer job, and that sort of thing. And then they do their teachings, they demonstrate it, and they find out it's a little bit too much for them, so they look for volunteers to help them, and or they begin charging, or both.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been, I think, the number one model. If you want to ask where I think everybody feels that that model of volunteering is to volunteer to be a teacher, volunteer to lead, to volunteer to be in charge of a coven, to try to lead and try to build something from there. I think every one of those positions tend to be volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
And
the vast majority of cases, yes.
And only a very tiny group of people ever see any money for classes. And you have to be pretty high up there and grab a lot of attention. I think there are people who deserve it, but I think a lot more deserve to be paid or to have compensation for teaching classes. The phenomenon I see today now is in Zoom. So many people are charging for all the classes that we were giving away for free, which we would have been doing for free. So we're guilty of being the ones who do give a lot of volunteer time.
Yes.
And I mean that on a personal level as well as, me, you, other people. And that's this idea of teaching. But from that comes this idea that there's an expectation of being owed something. And I think that's the hard part. I think that's one of the things I think people are having a hard time with. I.e., if I volunteer all my time to teach people and all this time to do things, and I don't build an infrastructure, I don't do a lot of things, and then suddenly I'm in trouble. My car breaks down. I break a leg. Let's not hit the university. Something happens, and then I need help. Well, there's no. If I haven't built a good system, there's no counter back end, and then I'm screaming to the public wild. And I think I've gotten into a paradox here. If 80% of our communities is both solitaire and non-groupized, means they're solitary and they're practitioner, and they don't belong to any of our groups or structure, then we're not their elders, and they owe us nothing.
That's true.
They don't. We owe that. They owe us nothing. I mean, that is one of the biggest things I see. It just owe nothing.
Unless for some personal reason they feel otherwise.
Right, but there's no debt.
Yeah.
No matter what you felt like,
It,
I gave all these years,
well, that's the other thing about it, though. If you're offering something, you're offering it. You
Mhm.
can't expect a repayment that you do not ask for.
Mm-mm.
And the fact that it suddenly occurs to you years later you probably should have doesn't change the fact you didn't. Which, I mean, in my mind, is one of the strengths of the traditions because there is infrastructure. There are expectations of the potential of the group, at least. But when there's no group at all, what you choose to do, you're choosing to do. And hopefully there'll be someone willing to help you if you need it. But I
Mhm.
don't know how you can necessarily have an expectation that there will be.
And
I mean, I
so
remember when Victoria Carlson in Chicago um, came into ill health at the end of her life, lots of people came out to help her. But
mhm,
she had been a benefactor of the community for so very long. And it was also during that time when the Chicago community was supercharged in its activities.
mhm.
Um, and she was the head of an organization. Um, but I've seen a lot of times where people, from their own choice, will come forward to help people who are in need. But it's not if you are not within some sort of lineal or organizational arrangement with them. I mean, it's a choice you make or you don't. You can't really call it an expectation.
And
And
then
yet, some people seem to expect quite a bit from people who have not actually come up under them.
mm-mm. No, and I think that's the idea of it, that somehow creating this group, which is now very solitary, is some sort that they should be benefited from. The third type of leadership or volunteer positions, the one that I want to talk more about, one last thing, are the ones that I think that are important to me. And those are the ones where you're building up a religious career. A career. We see it all
Hmm.
the time. Witch school is really super dependent on individuals who treat their volunteer job as a long-term commitment to
Hmm.
almost a career.
Yes, yes, absolutely. It
Lori
is a
Denman,
career.
it is a career. I mean, it's a
Hmm.
small one. I mean, it's not to dominate, and it can eat up many, many hours. We have the lady Lori Denham, who's I think she's back in London. She's just went to Greece.
Hmm.
Spectacular. I want to hear more about her, what her did.
Yes,
Um,
indeed.
and she's seen some benefit volunteerism in the fact that people want to meet with her. We have all sorts of people. Lori Blackman, who's given, even when she was trying to get her third degree, who's constantly working for us, and now is working for us towards the parliament.
Hmm.
You have high level people, lower level people. You have people you would not even know. The latest long term is Mary Hawk, who's helping with the station, and she spends
Hmm.
5, 10, at least 10 hours a week
Hmm.
doing programming, things like that. And she sees this as a long term career to build a long term organization. And those are the volunteers you're looking for too. So you're looking for volunteers of all sorts. And ultimately, what you want to do is you want to give them the opportunity. One of the things I think our volunteers done, and some of our volunteers have gone off and got regular jobs from it, learning social
Yes.
media, learning things. So you want to be able to always offer them some value. So it's
Hmm.
something to think about volunteerism, and we need volunteers, and we need to organize them. But and like we said, you need to start clearly stating what you need volunteers for, and see if there are people out there.
And you
And
make an interesting point that for some of these things, not only in return for their volunteer effort are they getting um, satisfaction and recognition, but they're learning skills they might not otherwise learn. For example, people involved with Pagan World are learning, in some cases, film editing, which
mhm.
is a very much a real world skill and not something everybody has. When we were doing magazines like The Roundtable, those are very real world skills. They're a little outdated now,
Mhm.
the way that we did the roundtable versus how magazines are done now. But the people who are part of our editing team for Corellian Publishing are learning how to put together books,
Mhm.
which is a skill they can take anywhere that puts together books.
Yes.
Uh,
Corellians have gained the magical power, the techno magical power to speak books into existence. We'll talk
Yes,
about that
indeed.
another time. So I guess that's it on volunteerism. Let's go ahead and talk about another thing I think is really kind of interesting, and as people are starting to become aware of it, that Public Domain Day 2023 was a day that really kind of exploded out into the world about what public domain is.
Hmm.
And this is where authors, 95 years after the creation of their writings, lose the right to be the only exclusive holders and only ones who get an obligation. So if you
Hmm.
write something, you're supposed to be able to hold on to it for 95 years. You and your family get to benefit from what the
Yes.
capitalization and the commoditization of information.
Mm. It is important to remember that different parts of the world may sometimes have different rules, but here definitely that is it.
So we're talking the United States of
Yes.
America, the heavyweight champions of that'll do as much as it can to protect its copyrights and its
It's the land
trademark.
of the mouse.
The land of the mouse. There it is. And so, but we just saw a bunch of stuff become public domain. 95
Hmm.
years later, all of uh, Sir Arthur Doyle's material is Sherlock Holmes. They're saying the entire canon of the original canon is allowed to be used, which means this is one of the more tricky ones. They're saying that you can use Sherlock Holmes, you can create them out of those books. You can say anything that's in those books, any of those characters, and develop your own stories without paying the family.
Hmm.
And the family's been charging outrageous funds. The family is saying it's been very difficult, and now you don't need to pay that family so much, except for the
Hmm.
controversial. Now, it doesn't mean you can't take another author's version of uh, like Sherlock Holmes or another writer who came after 1927. Their books, their things are theirs. So if they created an all new character, you couldn't use those characters. We could go absolutely. We could go.
Well, it's
Sherlock.
like
Hmm.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
I mean, I have had on the back burner the project of doing some animated features of some of his works because they've been in public domain for quite a while. You can absolutely adapt them at will, but you could not take the Edgar Allan Poe films of the 1960s and do the same
No.
because they're absolutely copyrighted.
So Metropolis has now entered public domain, which I think is probably one of the most important ones that came across.
Yes.
You found an old werewolf movie from 1925?
Yes. I have that right in front of me, or more or less right in front of me. I think it was called Wolf Blood.
Yes, it was.
And it is about someone who, there it is, Wolf Blood, 1925, 68 minutes long. After a wolf blood transfusion, a man thinks he's turning into a wolf. And it stars George Cheesebro, who is also the director.
Hmm.
Another thing that is in public domain has been for a few years is Hoxton, which is the famous 1922 film about witchcraft from
And we've shown
I
that
want to
one.
say Sweden. Hmm?
We've shown that one.
Yes, it's been in public domain for a little while, being made in 22. Um, but it's an example because it is so old. It's considered to have become part of the culture at this point, and it can be used.
So we're still talking, some of this material. Someone was mentioning High Magic by uh, Daryl Gardner won't
Hmm.
hit public domain until 1950, 2050. Yeah,
That
something like that.
sounds about
It was
high magic. I believe it's high magic's A.
1955. Hmm?
Okay, well then that would be 2050.
Yeah, and some of it a little bit earlier or later. So we're talking about some of the most written. A lot of the books that are in pagan domain to be considered the starting books. We're still looking at 20, 30, 40 years before they hit the public domain,
Hmm.
which means there's a whole generation that they have to love to learn to live with them before they get them.
Hmm.
Because you don't see a lot of reprints of Gardner's books or a lot of these books. So there's this gap that's going to happen now because we're a copyright society before
Hmm.
these books end up into public domain.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of books being written that will not be able to be used as real books, teaching books, in a big way because you the way we broadcast today, it's going to be very questionable if we can say use Llewellyn's books and the author's books
Hmm.
to say write a class. I mean, we can you can say, well, you read this one and we can read this one and we can read this one. We can make compilations. But with the copyright rules, could we say make a movie based on a book? The answer is no.
Hmm.
We'd have to get rights to it. So a lot of the great books won't enter, we're still looking at 2040, 2050, for, some of these early books, 2050,
Hmm.
you know, essentially 100 years, 95 years after they're written. So that has a real impact on us. One of
Hmm.
the answers for us was we did write the Common Book, which was written under Common Creatives.
Yes.
And that means you can utilize it, you can print it, you can utilize it for whatever you want, you can alter it. You can even create a whole book called the same thing, as long as you make sure that you recognize who the original writers were,
Hmm.
and that is a way that you can have that. We were hoping to have some of our materials uh,
Yes.
in there.
And if you're interested in the Common Book of Wicca and Witchcraft, or was it
Mhm.
Witchcraft and Wicca, whichever it is, if you're interested in the Common Book, you can find it at CorellianPublishing.com
And this
under
all came
books.
out of Kerfunkel with Z Budapest over the rights of uh, We All Come from the Goddess.
Hmm.
Do we really want to see a movie of High Magic's Aid? We might. Somebody might adapt it. Certainly, we want to know that it existed outside of the individual copywritten. Uh, Chichipan was asking this here. Let me show everybody. Here you go. How we pronounce it. There you go. Do we really want to see it? I want the right to do so. I certainly couldn't do it today.
There's an interesting series of films from the 70s
Mm-hmm.
of works of Dion Fortune, which may have been copyright free at that point, based on any number of different possibilities. But I'm not sure that they were. But they are out there, and it's interesting to see them. But we often talk about, as a community, that we would like to see ourselves more accurately represented by films and media. That can only happen if we are, in fact, represented in films and media.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Dion Fortune's um, well, the Goat Foot God is an example. Deal very clearly with what would be considered, at least under the larger definition that the term was coined for, Wicca, but they're not particularly flattering because it wasn't exactly her background. They're in the form of horror novels with us as the horror.
Mm-hmm.
Still entertaining to watch, and there's enough in there to get your attention, and it's interesting. Kind of like The Wicker Man. The Wicker Man is a wonderful film, the original. I'm one of those who really only feels that there is the original. But we are kind of cast as the villains, even though it was a great exposition of modern pagan culture. But for so long, that's all we could really do. But that isn't the world we're in now. But if we want to claim a more positive representation, we must actually make sure we
Mm-hmm.
are represented.
Right. And so that's what's so cool about public domain because you love to talk about the metaphysical aspect.
Yes.
Rev Don's Library of Horrors, which has become a popular feature. We'll see more of it in the future.
Well, this actually speaks directly to what we're talking about. We're talking about the next film for the Library of Horror, being The Brain That Would Not Die, which is in public domain. But the reason it's in public domain is that they bungled their copyright. It's not nearly 95 years old, but there are a lot of public domain films that aren't because either they bungled the copyright or the company went out of business and lost the copyright. But with The Brain That Would Not Die, it depends what version you're talking about, because they caught the fact that they'd made this mistake, added some scenes, and copyrighted that version. But the first version is still copyright free. Um, and so working with public domain can be an interesting thing.
Well, I find it very interesting. Like you can have a public campaign, like we're talking about silent film,
Hmm.
but if suddenly that you wanted to retrack all the music, which we've discovered,
Hmm.
that is copywritten. So your film can be copywritten because of the music and have a whole new version that people
Yes.
can copy.
Well, we were mentioning Huxon and also Metropolis, and those were both
Mhm.
silent films where the score was very important. But there have been many later scores written for them. I'm not even sure the originals survive. And those scores are not necessarily copyright free.
So you have to be
Um,
very careful with that.
yeah.
And I
So
think
the
it
film
really,
may be in public domain, and the music absolutely might not.
and we discovered that recently ourselves of how many people made claims against the music within our public domain
Hmm.
showing. So we're being more careful about that. But I also think it highly impacts what we're doing. A lot of what we put out there, um, we put them out in a sort of Creative Commons. If you put it on YouTube, we have a right to replay it from the original source, which is
Mm.
extremely valuable. We curate a lot of material. We're adding a lot of material that organize the pagan world. We're just putting some of the best materials we can find up on that site, so
Yes.
that people don't have to search through hundreds of hours of thousands of hours of YouTube, but we can extract something that shows our culture. And I think we're going to become a curated culture. But in no way do we ever go against that copyright. So if that owner decided to, decide they didn't like it, they could pull it from YouTube, and we would no longer be have it available to us.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think that's over and over again. So let's really quick. So what is going to happen to your writings when you pass away?
I'm sure at the very least we will have them under under some sort of license for use. We've
Hmm.
always talked about wanting them to be available.
Right.
The exact legal circumstances are a little beyond me, but I really
And
would like them to be available for people to use under all circumstances.
I think that's going to be, I think, yeah, that's going to be a little difficult, especially in this copyright hungry world.
Yes.
Um, you can own language. You're going to be able to own language in the future. What is a website, but the name of a website, but the owner of that language? We've learned that the Daily Spell exists since 1998 because we own the website, because we own the name, we own that,
Hmm.
um, and that sort of thing. Well, welcome, Cosmo and Tawny. Oh, good. I'm just glad you provided your Daily Spell live from prior day and stumbled onto this live now. What a fan! Now, yeah, thank you. I think that's I will show this because I think
Yeah,
it's nice.
we're planning to do it going forward.
And okay, so let's talk about this. So lots of good things, public domain, a lot of things that are happening with it. Think about also Creative Commons for some of the writings. And again, I think writers deserve credit and royalties and all that for them. It's not any sort of disdain for the fact that it is. It just be aware there's going to be a long time before people are pirating the books terribly.
Well, there's that too.
Yeah.
Pirating books is very big right now, particularly books from the metaphysical world.
Hmm.
Um, there are a number of sets available by otherwise unknown authors who don't actually exist, because what
Hmm.
they've done is they've copied someone else's manuscript and slapped a different name on it.
So keep an eye out for that.
Yeah. But I think it also depends on what your goal in writing the material was in the first place.
Hmm.
I mean, for me, the things I have written were always for a very particular purpose: to make a better world by making better people, giving better information. Um, and I've always pursued it that way. And fortunately, life has been kind to me in that. But it was never my goal to worry about who could or could not have access to it. I wanted everyone to have access to it, and I really still do. Um, but I've known a number of people in the creative arts who are much more concerned about control of their materials, who consequently never have anyone see their materials. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I'm put in mind of an associate um, who had written a book, was offered a contract for the book by Llewellyn, and they were too worried about the control of their material to accept the contract, and they might as well never have written the book. Nothing else ever really came from
Mm-hmm.
it. Whereas my stuff, in the early days of the internet, and possibly still, I was the most plagiarized pagan author because I was the most accessible.
Mm-hmm.
But my thought on that is it means lots more people got good information, so I'm not going to complain too loud.
And your material is done in 190 countries. We have 53 countries with ordained people. Um, yeah, we've not been really super strong in control. And then, and been very fortunate because people have allowed us to take and add their image, and we've been allowed to create these films, these sort of stories that are still
Hmm.
existing. I mean, we have a lot of people who have passed into Beyond the Veil that we have some of their story.
That's true.
And as we go on, we're going to have more of that story. So,
And it's not uncommon that some of those people who are now in spirit that we interviewed, no one else ever interviewed.
mhm.
Because there was not there weren't a lot of people doing that at that time.
I still think we're way short of how much interviewing time we need or how much film
Oh
people are going to
yes,
put out. I think that 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, we're going to be holding on to that cachet. So I do think that at some point in our community, we might want to start talking about how copyrights work and how we can compensate authors during their lives and their families, when they pass. But at
hmm
the same time, create some sort of collective which protects the copyrights and make sure that they don't get lost as they move towards public domain.
hmm
But that's me, as always, pipe dreaming away today. This is my daily dream of how we make a better community.
Well, we're in a similar position to the late Roman Empire in that the technology by which we pass on information is changing. At that time, it was changing primarily from scrolls to books. And a lot of information was lost because certain things simply were never translated into books.
Hmm.
And therefore, they did not get put in the new libraries. And they just gradually faded away. For us, we're moving from physical to electronic means of preserving knowledge.
Hmm.
And what does not get adapted is unlikely to be remembered very well.
Hmm.
One of the things I used to hear a lot, the works of Sappho are one of the greatest losses of antiquity. She was considered certainly the greatest Greek female poet, and some considered her the greatest Greek poet, period. But very little of her work survives. And I always heard when I was younger that this was because the church suppressed her work with the coming of Christianity, but turns out that's not true at all. What it was that she wrote in she did not write in the Attic dialect, different dialect of Greek. And when things were being selected for translation into books, not enough people still spoke that dialect. And so they just did not save her work. The great Attic writers, they were all passed right on. And, you know, I was talking to someone about my library the other day that many of the books here um, represent those private publications of the pagan community that may not have had more than 22 at most 100 150 published copies ever produced, and in some
Hmm.
cases I or some other collector will have the very last copy, and what we do with that copy determines whether that part of the community is remembered at all. I remember when we were talking about the pagan press earlier from the 1980s. I remember so many articles on um, philosophy and skills and spellcraft and so much artwork, which basically has just blown away in the wind because you could not find it online today. Nobody put it there. Um, Hopefully, in the future, some who still have those volumes will, and I think more is getting through. But some is simply gone, and I think that contributes to the constant forgetting of our community history.
I think so. So strengthening our libraries, figuring out how to deal with some of the copyright issues, I think there's some tied into elder care. How do some of this could actually help? These royalties can help out with paying for more of our community. I think we're heading for a great future, but one of the things
Hmm.
what we need to deal with is the idea of um, this idea of copyrights because I think it's going to be a bigger thing in the future.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that is going to be, and the good news about it is that Public Domain Day happened, and a lot of great stuff went into public domain.
Hmm.
I suspect you're going to see. I think there's going to be a whole spat of Metropolis materials and memes
I don't see how there could not be, as
because that's just an
iconic as that
iconic,
film is.
right? And maybe somebody, I can see with the modern some of those scenes, with voice actors playing out the voice parts.
Even that's something that's increasingly being done with old silent films.
Hmm.
And people trying to see what did they actually say. And in some cases, there's actual dialogue, and in some cases, they're just talking about things that have nothing to do with what's going on in the story.
I've seen that lip service, and people go, "That's not what they're saying." Trained lip service deaf people have a very different experience with silent movies. Us seeing people, we have to depend on those words.
Yeah. Well, we mentioned Metropolis,
Hmm.
um, and people forgetting history. Metropolis is famous for being one of the first, if not the first, great science fiction film,
It was,
full length.
that's a movie that is considered to put robot into the vernacular of the world.
Yes,
The word may have existed prior to it, but this was where it got
yeah,
inserted.
the the character of the robot, and I've heard different names given for the robot. I always
Hmm.
remember Forrest J. Ackerman's name for the robot being Metaluna, but I've heard other names as well. But it's so iconic. C-3PO in Star Wars was based on the robot from Metropolis.
Hmm.
But if you watch the scene where the robot is activated, you'll notice there's a big pentagram on the wall. And very often, the fact that there is a metaphysical sub-story to Metropolis is totally forgotten because they cut a lot of it out. Um, but there was meant to be considerable metaphysics in that story, and I would like to see some of that restored, um, since it now could be done. The novel Metropolis, which was written by the screenwriter who created the film, elaborated on those themes far more. Thea von Harbou. Um, and it would be very interesting, I think, to see some of that restored. Because if you look at Metropolis just as a science fiction film, what happens with the robot doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you think of it as science fiction and metaphysics together, it's a very different story.
Hmm. And soon to be on Don Lewis's Library of Horrors with his examinations. So we've
Yes.
talked a lot about out there and things of that nature. Thank you for listening. So in closing, we're really kind of looking at, the idea of volunteerism is important. And if you're going to look for volunteers to do things, give them something to really do. Think about how it's going to help them over the long term. What value are you giving your volunteers? I think it's important.
Yes.
Not what they can do for you, but what can you do for them? And figure out how to build those communities of trust and support that shows that everybody's time, their energy, and their resources are valued. And then public domain, let's have fun with that. I mean, start thinking about it. And I do think that a lot of writers who are using their material to begin the creation of their traditions, their practices, need to assure that that writing goes on,
Hmm.
even if something were to happen to them and those rights revert back to families. I'm dreadfully worried about when that begins to happen to some of these writers who have had it.
Hmm.
You know, um, what happens of it, and that we're still a long way off before we have our own public domain books.
Yes.
So all of that together, I think, has been very interesting. And so maybe we need to think about creating a few more common books. I think that'll be very interesting.
I think that would be a good project.
But right now, the project of the day is we're going to talk about more things here. But today's project is we're talking about become part of Pagan World. You can join us. If you want to help change the world, become a citizen of Pagan World. We're offering a special right now. And for Don, go out, look at his Kickstarter campaign, and let us see if you are interested in getting your own. Rev Don Lewis's Omnibus of Spells for All Incantations for All Occasions.
Close enough. Even I didn't remember the full name for a long time.
Yeah. And so with that, I think that is a great place for the daily spell. Tomorrow we're going to actually, I think, talk about spells and the idea of daily spells. Somebody asked me, says, "Are you going to start teaching spells and daily spells?" And I took a little bit of a look at the memes that are out there, the groups that are out there. The idea of teaching magic to beginners from where we started to where it is today, I think is a really interesting conversation. I think that's going to be our next conversation.
Very good.
And if you want to be join us or have anything to say, thank you. And thank you, Tawny. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you for Cosmo, Chipicon, and everybody else who joined us, Nicole and Margarita and Byron. Let's find out. Yeah, let's talk more. And this is it for Daily Spell. And as always, we're going to ask Don to do a small prayer for us in closing.
Well, let's see. Our theme today has included public domain materials and also volunteerism, both of which have to do with expression. So let us aim our prayer in that direction. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, in all of your names and forms, we ask you to aid us in expressing our message to the world. Help us to uncover our light, that others may see who and what we truly are, and that we are good and loving and positive people. May our lives be a testament to the goodness in our hearts, and may our works be a testament to the goodness in our hearts. Beloved ones, we ask you to help us to make this our reality. With love and with respect, we thank you, so mote it be. And until next time, may you bless it.